There are several passages in the book of Acts that bring to mind an interesting question. If I had the opportunity, would I preach the gospel in the worship center of a different religion? I like to think that I would. I like to think that I would take advantage of that opportunity. Here in Acts 13, we have Paul doing just that. At the beginning of this chapter, Paul and Barnabas are chosen to be missionaries. They face some opposition, but also see a political leader come to Christ. As they are traveling, we learn that John Mark leaves them and returns to Jerusalem. He will be mentioned again later. They arrive in Pisidian Antioch and go to the synagogue. As custom dictates, after the reading of the law and prophets, Paul and Barnabas are asked if they have an encouraging message for those present. I love this. Talk about a golden gospel opportunity. What could be more encouraging than the message of the gospel? Paul, knowing his audience, begins by walking through some Jewish history. In verse 17, Paul covers around 500 years. God did three things for Israel. He chose them. We learn about this in Genesis 12, 26, and 35. Exalted them, Genesis 41 and 46, and brought them out of Egypt in the book of Exodus. Verse 18 reminds Israel of God's patience and mercy in the wilderness. We see this all the way from Exodus to Numbers. Verse 19 mentions God's placement of them in the promised land. This is Deuteronomy to Joshua. In verse 20, Paul covers the book of Judges and the beginning of 1 Samuel. Verse 21 takes us into Israel's rejection of God ruling over them and their desire to be like the other nations with a king. God grants this request, but ultimately removes Saul, as we see in the beginning of verse 22. What is Paul doing with this history lesson? He is setting them up. He is making a connection, drawing them in so that they want to hear what he is saying. With that in mind, he next talks about King David. Now, after establishing this connection, Paul begins to bring the gospel to them. Jesus is the promised descendant of David in verse 23. He is the one John the Baptist spoke of, verses 24 and 25. Through him is salvation, verse 26. Paul reviews what was done to Jesus before, during, and shortly after his death in verses 27 to 29. The gospel presentation that Paul gives here is centered on the resurrection. Verse 30 declares the fact of his resurrection. Verse 31 states the evidence of his resurrection. Many people saw him. Verses 32 and 33 reiterate that everything surrounding the life and ministry of Jesus was fulfilling the promises made by God to the Israelites. In verses 33 to 35, Paul quotes two Psalms and a passage from Isaiah. These quotations serve to emphasize the deity of Christ, his connection to David, and the prophetic nature of his death, burial, and resurrection. Verses 36 and 37 show the superiority of Christ over David. David's body turned back into dust. Jesus Christ was raised from the dead, and so his body never saw corruption. Because of the superiority of Christ, because of his death, burial, and resurrection, because his entire life fulfilled prophecy, because of all these things, forgiveness is found in Jesus. Look at Acts chapter 13, verses 38 and 39. Let it be known to you, therefore, brothers, that through this man forgiveness of sins is proclaimed to you, and by him everyone who believes is freed from everything from which you could not be freed by the law of Moses. The law couldn't bring freedom from sin. Only Jesus can do that. All who believe in Jesus are freed from sin. The response to Paul's message is varied. Some wanted to hear it again, verse 42. Some believed, verse 43. When Paul and Barnabas were going to teach again the next week, and a huge crowd gathered, in verse 44, the Jews were jealous and angry, verse 45. They begin to raise opposition to Paul and Barnabas. Paul announces they will go to the Gentiles, and eventually, the opposition causes Paul and Barnabas to leave, verse 51. However, verse 49 tells us that the word of the Lord spread despite opposition. And verse 52 says this, "And the disciples were filled with joy and with the Holy Spirit." Here is our challenge from all of this. When there is a gospel opportunity, take it. Build connection with the audience. Clearly share the gospel and trust God to do his work. Will you make a commitment with me? If so, say this: regardless of opposition, I will share the gospel at every opportunity. Say that one more time. Regardless of opposition, I will share the gospel at every opportunity.